Star was one of those games that seemed epic to me. It was a grand adventure about a girl traveling across 3 different worlds seeking revenge for the murder of her brother. That right there to me was more than my 5-year-old mind could handle. The idea of any game taking more than 1 session to beat was just unheard of. However, as I grew up, this daunting task of memorizing what villagers said, leveling up my characters, and mapping out dungeons on graph paper didn't seem all that bad to me. Eventually, I would beat Phantasy Star in my teens, having it become one of my all-time favorite RPGs. It's actually one of the few JRPGs that I would play multiple times throughout my life. Then in 2003, Sega started releasing remakes of their older titles under the 3D Ages line. You might recognize some of these titles as part of the Sega's Classic Collection for the PS2. The first of these games is none other than Phantasy Star Generation 1, a remake of the original Master System RPG. When I first heard of this, I was ecstatic. I couldn't believe that Sega would actually revisit this game and give it a fresh coat of paint. Though at the time of its announcement, it was a Japan-only release. Naturally though, I waited for the game to come stateside, and well, that never happened. The only news I read about it was that Conspiracy Games were going to bring it stateside as part of a collection which was supposed to include remakes of Part 2 and 4. Then after hearing no further updates on that situation, I decided to snag myself a Japanese copy, confidently believing that my experience with the original could overcome any language barrier that might be there. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Almost immediately, I got stuck. So yeah, I spent hours and hours trying to figure out what to do next. It was at that point I realized that there was more to this game than I originally thought. So I simply placed the disc back in its case and hoped that someday someone could figure this out. Then in August of 2012, a crew in the Phantasy Star Cave forums released an English patch. Tryphon, Oracario Rob, and Vivify93, and many others worked on this mod for 2 years, trying and successfully bringing this translation to the English-speaking fanbase. And I'm happy to say that they did an amazing job. Of course, the team took some liberties with some of the translation, but all in all, it stays faithful to the 1988 experience. Now, Generation 1 is your basic old school RPG, but instead of a fantasy setting, you're playing in a sci-fi one. But the typical elements are here: leveling up, buying new gear, exploring dungeons, the regular things you would find in an RPG. However, unlike the game that this version is based off of, Generation 1 plays vastly different. Movement on the overworld and towns are much faster, and you can now move in 360 degrees. Traveling between towns and villages now takes mere moments. Even the Land Rover seems unnecessary now. Moving in dungeons is a bit unusual though. Usually in games with 3D dungeons, pushing forward up for a split second causes the player to move forward 1 block. This made it easy to map out dungeons on graph paper. In Generation 1, however, you only move ever so little. You could continue to move as long as you hold the up or down button, but the player stops immediately after letting go, regardless if you're fully inside a block or not. This would be a problem for traditional map makers, but the inclusion of a purchasable atlas negates the need of making your own maps. But there was always something special about drawing out each individual dungeon, taking notice how far you traveled as you explored further and further in. Still, I can't argue with how much time you could save by using the atlas. Combat seems easier now. It seems that the enemies are weaker in a sense and don't attack in numbers unless you have more members in your party. Plus, you can level up relatively quickly. usually by 5 levels within an hour depending on the area or dungeon you're in. Nonetheless, this still plays like an old school RPG, and you will need to prepare to travel to new areas. Like upgrading equipment and stockpiling up on supplies and such. There's also some sort of elemental based attack mechanic built into the combat system. Basically, some enemies are weaker against some magics and equipments than others, though I don't see much of a difference that would merit keeping track of which enemies are weak against what. What is probably the most annoying thing about Phantasy Star Generation 1 would be the amount of randomized battles. Now, we all know that random battles is part of any old school RPG. It's par for the course. It's how a player obtains experience points and money. But Gen 1 takes it a little too far. These fights occur constantly. Whether you're in a dungeon or overworld, your progress will slow down to a crawl. And I don't remember Phantasy Star having these many battles. Fortunately, they do tone it down near the end of the game, but it's really, 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 really annoying having to deal with these battles consistently. All the graphics were redrawn from the ground up. These new assets have nice detail to them, which match the mid-2000s anime aesthetic. Personally, I would have liked it if they stuck with the 80s look of the original, but that's my preference. Still, D3 publishers did not stray too far from the original look and designs. Anybody who's played the original Master System version can tell what monsters are which. Alex and crew now have attack animations. You can now see your actions take place, unlike before where all you see was some weird tear across the screen, which was supposed to represent an attack. Enemy attacks have also been reanimated and now look more fluid in motion. 3D dungeons are now, well, in 3D. Textured polygons surround the player instead of a pre-animated screen. This is a pleasant surprise, especially since textures look like the area you're supposed to be in, i.e. being in a cave, it looks like you're in a cave. If you're in a dungeon or a palace, it looks like you're in a dungeon or a palace. Music has been redone, though instead of creating new tracks, they kept the original melodies and just modernized it a bit. I can't say that the whole soundtrack is good, but the main theme truly captures the essence of the original. Though with the other tracks, they did experiment with the music a bit, leaving some tracks with a lot to be desired. Maneuvering your party in the overworld map is somewhat loose. It's like I stated before, you're no longer relegated to 4 directions. You can now move Alyssa and her team in 360 degrees with the use of the analog stick and in various speeds. Since this is a Japanese game, the function of the X and circle buttons are in reverse. So entering or selecting an option is assigned to circle while X is used to back out. It will take a little time to get used to, but not too long. Now you may not know this, but the 3D Aegis series of games was part of a line of budgeted modern remakes. Anyone who's played the Sega Classics compilation will recognize some of these titles. And as you can tell, they didn't really put too much effort in most of these. And some of that low effort is actually present here. Despite adding new dialogue and fleshing out the story, this game is mostly the same. There's no bonus side missions, no extra dungeons, not even new enemies. So anyone who's a fan of the original could expect more of the same with just like a fresh coat of paint. And there you have it, guys. Phantasy Star Generation 1 on the PS2. What grade do I give this game? Well, as much as I love Phantasy Star, I can't just give this game a high score. I give it a C. Now, why a C and not a B or an A? Well, as I mentioned in the video, this was a budgeted release. They pretty much did the bare minimum here. And they did add a couple of things. I'm not going to lie. They, added an extra layer of combat mechanics, and, they fleshed out the story. They even included a feature where you could talk amongst your party members, so you could figure out where to go next and kind of flesh out the characters a little bit. So yeah, they did that. But besides that, nothing much else. The dungeon maps are basically the same. The bosses are the same. There's no new enemies, no new towns to visit. And yeah, even though some of the townspeople and villagers say new things as you beat certain bosses and progress the story, it's mostly the same game. And I really don't feel, comfortable with that. I wish they would have done something like a 3D overworld with perhaps polygonal monsters or polygonal characters and perhaps a animated CG cutscene or something. Something like that to kind of give a better presentation of the original story. But they didn't do that, and I wish they did, but I guess they didn't have a lot of money to work with. But still, this is an awesome title. I can only recommend this to Phantasy Star fans or fans of old school RPGs. This game fetches for around 40 to 50 bucks. And if you do get a Japanese copy, be prepared to patch this game, because if you don't speak Japanese, you're gonna have a tough time playing like I did. I got stuck in the first section for hours and hours and hours, and I just had to give up. Anyway, this was Knockout 21. Please comment, rate, and subscribe, and like always, have a good one. Take care, you guys.